They were offered the sensible option first. Lay down your weapons. Open the post. Save your lives. What happened next is the reason Saragarhi still feels less like military history and more like a dare thrown at death itself. 21 men looked at thousands outside their walls and chose not survival, not retreat, not even rescue. They chose time. And time, on that day, was worth more than their lives. The position they held was not supposed to become immortal. Saragarhi was a signaling post on the harsh frontier between Fort Lockhart and Fort Gulistan, a stony outwork in a region that punished weakness and devoured isolated men. It was important, but in an almost mechanical way. It passed messages. It kept the line alive. It was a hinge, not a throne. No empire writes poems about hinges, until the hinge becomes the thing that stops the door from breaking open. By the morning of September 12, 1897, the frontier was already burning. Tribal forces had gathered in huge numbers across the Samana Ridge. The British Indian frontier system was under pressure, forts were vulnerable, and the whole logic of the defense depended on communication holding just long enough to keep scattered positions from being swallowed one by one. That made Saragarhi dangerously valuable, small enough to seem expendable, important enough that losing it at the wrong moment could blind the entire local defense. Inside that post were soldiers of the 36th Sikhs, men trained for discipline so severe it almost seems unreal now. At their head stood Havildar Ishar Singh, not a grand prince, not a famous conqueror, not a commander arriving with banners and legend already attached to his name. Just a non-commissioned officer on an ugly frontier, in a place too small for glory, with responsibility pressing down on him harder than the stone walls around him. That is part of what gives the story its force. The men at Saragarhi were not standing inside a grand final chapter that history had already marked in gold. They were living through confusion, dust, distance, and the knowledge that help might never come. And then the mass of the attack became clear. Accounts differ on the exact size of the tribal force, but every version agrees on the essential fact. The defenders were hopelessly outnumbered. Not by a little. Not by the kind of odds that make for dramatic posters. By the kind of odds that make resistance look irrational. The attacking force moved against a post manned by 21 soldiers. From the forts nearby, observers could see the pressure building. They could see Saragarhi about to be hit by a storm it had no realistic means of surviving. This is the point where most military stories offer some hidden advantage. Better ground, better guns, a planned trap, reinforcements around the corner. Saragarhi had none of that in any comforting sense. Its advantage was that its defenders knew exactly what their job had become. They were no longer protecting a building. They were protecting time between stronger positions. Time for Fort Lockhart to understand what was happening. Time for Fort Gulistan to brace. Time for a local crisis not to become a collapse. They could not win in the ordinary sense, but they could make themselves expensive. That changes everything, because surrender is easier when you think your death buys nothing. Saragarhi's defenders had a harder burden. They understood that dying well could matter more than living badly. The post was equipped with a heliograph, and through that flashing line of light, they remained connected to Fort Lockhart even as the ring tightened around them. The battle was not happening in silence. It was being watched, reported, almost measured in human endurance. Men at the fort could receive message after message as the defenders described what they were seeing and what they intended to do. Imagine the cruelty of that. To know they were visible. To know others were watching. To know those others could not save them. The attackers called on them to give up. That matters. Saragarhi was not a story of men trapped so suddenly that choice vanished. Choice remained. The option to surrender was there. It was rejected. And that rejection is what turned the battle from a military episode into a moral one. Ishar Singh and his men did not fight because they had no alternative. They fought because they decided duty meant something even after survival was removed from the equation. That decision sounds clean from a distance. It was not clean inside the walls. Hours stretched. Shots were exchanged. The defenders used every advantage they had, firing from cover, conserving strength, forcing the attackers to pay for every approach. The walls of the post, modest and vulnerable, suddenly became the edge of a world. Outside was pressure without limit. Inside was a shrinking pocket of will. Assaults came in waves. Each time the attackers tested the defenses, the Sikhs answered with disciplined fire and refusal. The scale gap did not disappear. It became more brutal because the smaller force was still there. From Fort Lockhart, officers and soldiers watched through field glasses as much of the fight as distance allowed. They saw the enemy close in. They saw attempts to set the post alight. They saw bodies gathering around a place that, by all ordinary math, should already have been overrun. And still Saragarhi held. The first payoff of the battle was simple and savage. The 21 were doing what they had no business being able to do. But the deeper pressure was building elsewhere. Fort Gulistan was also under threat, and the whole point of the attack on Saragarhi was larger than one tiny outpost. If the signaling post fell quickly, the attackers could exploit confusion, isolate the neighboring positions, and turn local superiority into a chain reaction. This is why the battle matters beyond its legend. The defenders were not merely acting out some pure ritual of courage. They were interfering with enemy timing. Every minute they held forced the attackers to spend effort, attention, and blood on a position that should have been disposable. Their resistance was becoming strategic. That is the hard twist in the middle of the story. Heroism here was not decorative. It was functional. The attackers understood that too. They adapted. Smoke and brush were used to obscure movement. Sections of the perimeter were tested for weakness. Pressure increased where the defenders were thinnest. What had begun as intimidation was becoming method. The wall had to be opened somehow, because a post defended by men willing to die could not be broken by fear alone. It had to be physically torn apart. Inside, the defenders were running through the ugly arithmetic that all last stands eventually face. Ammunition falls. Angles vanish. Exhaustion grows. Every wounded man becomes both a moral weight and a tactical loss. The space does not get larger. It gets smaller with every breach, every fire, every point the enemy learns. The battle stops being about whether the position can be saved and becomes about how much punishment can still be inflicted before the end. And yet they kept signaling. One of the most haunting details in the Saragarhi story is that the men inside were not disappearing into legend while the fight happened. They were reporting the collapse in real time. Message after message carried the shape of the battle outward. Requests, updates, observations, permission to keep fighting, permission to die where they stood. The line between witness and participant almost vanished. Fort Lockhart could not intervene, but it could bear witness to a defense becoming something larger than a garrison action. That gave the battle a terrible clarity. No one could later claim these men had stumbled into martyrdom by accident. Their stand was seen. It was understood. It was chosen. Then came the moment every doomed position dreads. The defenders could no longer trust the walls. The attackers managed to exploit cover and get close enough to start opening the post. Fire, smoke, and concentrated pressure began to do what numbers alone had not yet achieved. Saragarhi was still fighting, but now the geometry of the battle was changing. A defended perimeter is one kind of problem. A broken perimeter is another. Once the outer shell starts to fail, discipline is tested in a harsher way. Men are no longer merely holding a line. They are preparing to be swallowed by their own battlefield. And Ishar Singh did not pull his men inward to bargain, or signal surrender, or ask for terms. He prepared them for the part of the story that would make Saragarhi unforgettable. What followed was no longer a defense in the comfortable military sense. It was a controlled collapse conducted by men who had already accepted the answer to the only question that mattered. They were not asking whether they would survive. They were deciding how long the enemy would have to suffer before the post was finally taken. That is a different kind of battle. Cleaner in one way, more terrifying in another. Hope narrows. Duty hardens. Every act becomes deliberate. As the walls failed, the fight broke into fragments. The defenders shifted from holding ground to contesting entry, from guarding a perimeter to turning every interior corner into one more delay. That sounds small. It was not small. A post like Saragarhi did not need to remain intact to remain useful. It only needed to keep resisting. Every new pocket of resistance forced the attackers to slow down, regroup, and pay again. A battle that should have ended in one clean rush turned into a sequence of costly steps. And Ishar Singh seems to have understood exactly what that meant. There is a reason his name survives while so many officers with larger commands are forgotten. He was not directing a maneuver that promised escape. He was leading men through the final stage of a mission that had already become fatal. That demands a colder kind of authority. Not the authority that says follow me and we may yet win. The authority that says follow me because what we are doing still matters even now. On battlefields, that difference is enormous. One kind of leadership feeds on hope. The other survives after hope has run out. The defenders kept fighting from inside a post that was turning against them. Fire and smoke reduced visibility. Openings appeared where there had once been cover. The attackers, who had expected a small garrison to crack under overwhelming pressure, now had to force their way through a defense that refused to behave logically. The whole point of superior numbers is to make the smaller side feel outnumbered. At Saragarhi, the smaller side never forgot the odds. It simply refused to let the odds dictate the tempo. That is why the story still bites. If this had only been an emotional stand, it would be moving. But temporary emotion fades. Saragarhi endured because the resistance remained useful. While the post-absorbed attack, nearby positions gained time. The defenders at Fort Gulistan, who might have been hit under worse conditions, had breathing room. Fort Lockhart had warning, visibility, and a clearer sense of the enemy's intent. In other words, the men inside Saragarhi were not dying in isolation. They were holding a piece of a wider frontier system together with their own bodies. That makes the story harsher, not softer. Because now the heroism is tied to calculation. Their deaths were not only noble, they were employed. That is the dark nerve under the legend. These Sikh soldiers fought with astonishing commitment, but they fought inside the structure of British imperial rule on behalf of a frontier designed by an empire that depended on men like them to hold ground for a crown far away. Their courage is unquestionable. The machine that used it is another matter. That contradiction is what gives Saragarhi its weight in the modern world. Strip away the emotion and you miss the human grandeur. Ignore the imperial setting and you miss the moral discomfort. Both are true at once. 21 men chose duty under impossible odds. They also did so inside a colonial order that knew how to turn loyalty into infrastructure. The empire needed communications posts, ridge defenses, disciplined native regiments, and men willing to stand when a position became indefensible. Saragarhi offered all of that in its purest form. Heroism and exploitation sat in the same room. But none of that would have mattered if the defenders had broken at the crucial moment. They did not. One by one, the post was consumed. The accounts that survive describe a final resistance so stubborn that even the attackers appear to have recognized its ferocity. There is something almost theatrical in the structure of the ending, but the power comes from the fact that it was real enough to be observed, reported, and remembered by people watching from Fort Lockhart. The last phase was not a dramatic flourish added later by patriotic imagination. It was the end point of a battle already witnessed through signals and distance, already understood as extraordinary while it was still happening. Among the most remembered details is the action of the signalman, often identified as Gurmukh Singh, who continued transmitting updates from the post as the defense collapsed. The image is almost unbearable in its clarity. A young soldier still at his instrument, still sending word outward while the world inside the walls is being narrowed to its final shape. It is not just brave, it is precise. He was preserving the meaning of the battle even as the battle destroyed him. The defense would not vanish into rumor because one of its defenders made sure the story escaped. Think about what that means. Saragarhi was not saved, but Saragarhi was successfully delivered to history. That is rare. Many last stands are remembered because later generations need symbols. Saragarhi became a symbol because its own defenders helped create the record in the middle of the disaster. They did not only hold the post, they held the narrative long enough for it to pass beyond the smoke. That is part of why the battle feels so immediate even now. We are not just hearing about a doomed stand. We are hearing an echo of men who understood, in real time, what was being asked of them. When relief and counteraction came later, the material truth was plain. The post had fallen. The defenders were dead. The numbers associated with the attacking force and its losses remained debated, as frontier accounts often are, but the strategic result was unmistakable. Saragarhi had delayed the enemy long enough to complicate the wider assault, and the defense entered military memory almost at once as something far beyond ordinary regimental conduct. The men of the 36 Sikhs were later honored in a way that reflected not just sacrifice, but recognized distinction. That happened because everyone involved understood the basic fact. They had done more than die hard. They had altered the day, And still, the most unsettling part of the story may be what did not happen. No miracle rescue arrived. No last-minute cavalry charge burst over the ridge. No brilliant counterstroke reversed the fall of the post. Saragarhi does not flatter us with salvation. It denies the viewer the emotional comfort most war stories eventually provide. The defenders were not rewarded with life for their courage. They were rewarded with consequence. That is much colder. It is also more honest. There is a brutal discipline in stories like that. They force a harder question. What is loyalty worth when it does not save you? What is courage worth when it cannot change the ending for the men performing it? Saragarhi answers in the most severe possible way. It says courage can still change the ending for everyone around you. It says a small stand can still reshape a larger battle. It says the value of resistance is not always measured by survival. Sometimes it is measured by what your refusal prevents. That is why surrender matters so much in this story. Or rather, the refusal of it. If the men at Saragarhi had chosen to yield, history might not judge them harshly. The odds were insane. The position was compromised. The empire would have lost a post and replaced it. Most viewers would understand. But that is exactly why the refusal has such force. These men were not cornered by confusion into making one last gesture. They saw the line between surrender and continued resistance and stepped over it knowingly. Not because death was glorious, because duty, discipline, regimental honor, and the immediate tactical need were stronger than the instinct to preserve themselves. That does not make the story simple. It makes it severe, because once you accept that, Saragarhi stops being a fairy tale about brave men and becomes something sharper. It becomes a story about the frightening power of drilled belief, about how military identity can turn a handful of soldiers into a wall, about how empire depends not merely on weapons, but on men who can be made to treat impossible orders as sacred. The same quality that makes the defenders admirable also reveals the system's hunger for exactly that type of man. That is the final discomfort. The legend is beautiful. The machinery behind it is not. And yet the beauty remains. Not because empire deserves romance. Not because death in uniform cleanses politics. But because inside that machinery, individual men still made individual choices. Ishar Singh still had to stand there. Gurmukh Singh still had to keep signaling. The others still had to fire, hold, endure, and refuse. Structure explains the battlefield. It does not erase the people inside it. That is the line Saragarhi forces us to walk. Admiration without innocence. Respect without amnesia. So the battle survives for a reason larger than numbers. 21 men at an outpost too small to matter in legend prove that size is not what makes a stand historic. Pressure does. Clarity does. Refusal does. Saragarhi endures because it strips war down to one of its most merciless truths. Sometimes there is no victory left to win, no rescue left to expect, no future left to bargain for. There is only the question of whether you will still hold your place when the world outside your walls has already decided you are finished. At Saragarhi, 21 men answered that question. And the answer was so severe that an empire kept the story, a regiment sanctified it, and history never fully found a way to make it comfortable.